and welcome along to the traditional wreath kit tutorial. Thank you so much for purchasing your kits. I hope when you opened your boxes you were absolutely delighted with the array of foliages and sort of festive elements in your kits. We've really put together kits this year that are just so abundant, so sort of luxurious, hopefully not something that you'll find everywhere. And yeah, I really hope you enjoy this sort of hour or so of kind of relaxation and peace and quiet, and I hope you've got some nice Christmas music playing and a glass of something on the go. So I'm going to teach you, or take you through step by step, how to create a beautiful professional looking wreath. So in your wreath kits you will have all of the elements. You will have your moss, your various foliages that we'll go through in a minute. You'll have your wreath ring, you'll have your burgundy ribbon, you will have your sort of decorative elements, and all you need is a pair of scissors or secateurs. Okay, so let's start. The first thing I'm going to do is put the ribbon, the twine, and the single wire behind, just because I always lose it amongst all the kind of chaos when we start breaking everything down. So to begin with, you take your binding wire and you just bring off a little bit at the end, and you basically just start wrapping it round one of the sort of the outer ring of your wreath ring, and you're just going to be going over and under, creating a sort of zigzag effect, a zigzag pattern. Now the purpose of this is just to create a base to put your moss on top of. So it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to look pretty, you're just creating that zigzag pattern with your binding wire. And it's worth noting at this point that you don't take your binding wire off until the end. Okay, I'm also going to move these cones and lotus to the end so they don't get damaged. Okay, so we're now going to take our sphagnum moss. Now your moss is not pretty, it's not aesthetically pleasing. I promise you won't see it. It's purely to provide the sort of base structure to your wreath, and if you keep it damp, it kind of provides a bit of a sort of water source for your foliages. So you're going to take a sort of a handful of your sphagnum moss, lay it on top of your zigzag pattern on top of your wreath ring, and then you're going to carry on going up and over, binding your sphagnum moss to your wreath ring. Now you will have quite a lot of sphagnum moss in your kits. Ideally use all of it if you can. The more you have on there, sort of the more depth you will have to your wreath, the more sort of abundant it will look, because it just provides a sort of dense, sort of chunky structure, and it results in a fuller looking wreath. So you're going up and over, just securing that moss to the wreath. And just be rest assured that you're not going to see the moss. So you can use all of the unattractive bits, all of the brown bits. I promise you won't see it. And again, keep your binding wire attached to your wreath ring. Don't snip it off until the end. Okay, so that is your wreath, copper wreath base, all mossed up, ready to go. So I'm just going to pop that to one side, and the first thing we're going to do is start breaking down all of our foliages and sort of textural elements into sort of sections, so then when we come to actually make the wreath, we can take little bits, make the little individual posies that sort of make up your final wreath. Okay, so we're going to start with the pistache. So this is a lovely kind of deep green tone. It's a dense foliage. It's not what I would call the showstopper. So it's not, you know, the most beautiful foliage out of all of them, but it really provides a kind of structure and a density to your wreath, and it's a really good, what I would call a filler foliage. So we'll start by breaking this down, and you're looking to sort of create little sections that are sort of 6 inches, 5 or 6 inches big, and you're just going to pop those in a pile. So breaking down into sort of that kind of size. Now this is definitely the sort of more labour intensive part of wreath making, sort of breaking all of your foliage up and into the right sort of size, but once it's done we can get to the fun sort of more creative bit and actually construct the wreath. This is probably the one that's going to take the longest actually. I've started you off with the one that takes the most time. Okay, so that is your pistache, all cut and ready to go, and then I just pop it in a pile, and then I'll move that to one side. And now we're going to do the spruce. So this is, you know, your festive Christmas tree. It smells incredible. It smells like Christmas. So we'll just break this down into sections. So again, you're looking at sort of 5-inch sections. You're kind of cutting off the main sort of trunk, I guess. So you're cutting into sections like that. And you can take the little bits off if you want to, and if you want to include them, you can. So again, just to reiterate, just sections like this off the main trunk, and hopefully as you're cutting it you can smell the beautiful Christmas scent. Spruce cut down. to one side. And now I'm going to cut the buried myrtle. So that's the sort of green foliage with the deep purpley blue berries. There's two sort of blue berries, but this is the kind of denser sort of foliage based one. So again, similar to how you did the stash and the spruce, we're just cutting little sections like so and putting that to one side. Nearly there on the myrtle. This dries out beautifully. It's a lovely tone of berry as well. Okay, so that's your buried myrtle. So we'll just move that to the side. And then I'm going to go this end and I'm going to do the another berry, the buried ivy. I'm just going to take the yucky leaves off. And again, it's exactly the same. You're just cutting it into little sections, you know, sort of 5-6 inches long. Creates a beautiful texture with the berries and the dark glossy kind of green leaves. Nearly there. Okay, so that is the buried ivy finally done. So again, I'm going to put that in a pile to the side. And then we're going to move on to the Ralphie. So the Ralphie is a sort of two-tone foliage. It has sort of a lovely kind of silvery grey bottom of the leaf and then a sort of sage green at the top. It's a really, really lovely textural foliage and it works beautifully in this wreath. So again, I'm just going to cut this down into sort of little sections, about 5-6 inches long, and pop those in a pile. Nearly there on the Ralphie. Okay, so that is also going to go in a pile and we'll place it at the side. And now we'll cut down our eucalyptus stems. Again, it's a lovely tone of sort of silver grey, smells beautiful, and just adds another kind of sort of tonal texture to your wreath. So you're just going to cut it down into, again, sort of 6-inch pieces, and pop that in the pile in front of you. Okay. Perfect. And then now we're just going to cut down the last few sort of little more textural elements, so the more berried elements. So first of all, we have the viburnum berries, which are this sort of kind of deep blue, blacky kind of iridescent berry. You might find that the foliage on them isn't particularly pretty, might be a bit dried, not particularly aesthetically pleasing. That's normal. You can remove that foliage if you want to. Unless it's really bad, I tend to leave it on because I like the fact that it just adds another kind of texture to my wreath, but it's up to you. So you're just going to break this down into sections. You can do them quite short if they kind of sit on a stem close to the main middle stem. That's fine, but just sort of, I'd say 3 inches is your minimum length. Ideally keep them as long as possible. Okay, so that's the viburnum. And then we will go with the red skimmia, always such a popular foliage in the wreath workshops. It's a lovely deep red, doesn't have too much yellow in there, doesn't have too much blue in there. It's a really good tone of red, and it's beautiful for Christmas. So I'm just going to cut this down into sort of little fronds like this. So you'll probably have around 8 sort of skimmia buried sections. I think I've taken too much from my workshop, so I don't actually need them because it gets lost. If you add too much in, it just gets lost. So you probably are looking to have about 8 of the buried sections. And then I tend to then use the foliage on my the rest of the stem, just because it adds a different texture. Again, you don't have to, but if you want to cut that down, you can. It's quite a nice glossy tone, glossy green leaf. Okay, and then you will have your rose hip stems. So they might be cut down already, but if not, you can just trim them down, and you're kind of looking to have like 6 sort of little sections of rose hips in your wreath. Okay, and then you will have your dried nigella, like a small bunch of dried nigella. Again, this is just to add touches. I just thought it was a nice thing to add because it has this sort of almost like a burgundy red tone, which really picks out the sort of different tonal elements in your wreath. So I'm going to leave mine, and I'm just going to break it with my hands when I do come to add it into my wreath. I might just trim the stems slightly so that they're not too annoying on the bench, but apart from that, I'm just going to leave that be and put that in front of me. Okay, so we've now broken everything down. So the next stage is to start creating our wreath. Now, the best sort of tip that I can give you to create a really professional looking wreath is to lay your posies, that I'm going to show you how to make in a second, all in the same direction. So they're all facing the same direction. So for example, when I make wreaths, My posies all point in a clockwise motion, so they all go around the wreath that way. You might think, your brain might be the other way around, and you might go in a sort of anti-clockwise motion. But the main thing is just that all of your posies head in the same direction. That will become clear in a minute when we start laying our posies down on our wreath. Okay, so to make your posies, you take little sections from each of the piles you have and create like a lovely little sort of foliage bundle, I guess. Your binding wire is still on your wreath ring, and I keep mine in the middle. I always work at sort of, if you imagine your wreath ring as a clock, 12, 3, 6, 9. I always lay my posies down on my wreath at 9 o'clock. If you feel natural working in the opposite way, so in an anti-clockwise way, you will probably want to lay your wreath posies at 3 o'clock. So mine are going at 9 o'clock, and they're going to head face upwards, and I'm going to twist my wreath round like this and lay them down, but that will become clear in a second. Okay, so let's start making our posies. So I'm going to take some spruce first. I'm going to take some myrtle, so a couple of pieces of myrtle, because we've got quite a lot of it. Sorry, not myrtle, pistache. Then I'm going to add my myrtle. And then I'm going to put some Ralphie on top and some ivy berries. I'm going to do 2 of those. I'm going to pop some eucalyptus on, take some of those leaves off. And then my sort of showstopper, which is sort of the thing that aesthetically I like the most, is my red skimmia in this posy. So I'm going to lay that on top. I'm then going to break off a little bit of nigella, the dried nigella, just a little bit, and lay that on top as well. Okay, so now I'm going to take my posy in my hand, really nice and tight, and I'm going to lay it on my wreath ring over the moss, so directly over the moss, pointing sort of upwards but slightly out, tilting slightly out to the outside of your wreath ring, and then I'm going to bind that round up and over 3 times. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to lay the binding wire down, and then I'm going to twist my wreath ring. So then I have a new 9 o'clock, which is where my new posy will sit on top of the binding wire that's on the stems of the previous posy. So I'm going to make another posy now. We're probably looking to create about 12 posies in total to go in your wreath. So I'm going to add the pistache, I'm going to add the myrtle, the ivy berries. I'm going to put in some blue viburnum berries in this one, and I'm going to pop in some red rosehip as well. Pop some Ralphie in for that lovely sort of tonal difference, and some eucalyptus as well. Okay, and then I'm going to lay this posy on top of my previous posy's binding wire. So I just simply lay it down on top, tilting slightly outwards on top of the moss, and then we bind the stems nice and assertively. You can be quite hard with it, it's not going to break. You don't want to do it loosely because then it will all fall apart when you lift it up, so do it really nice and tight. I lay that back down and then I twist. So then I've got my new 9 o'clock on my clock face, which is the binding wire of the previous posy, and that is where I'm going to lay my next posy down. Okay, so we're going to make a new posy. So I'm going to take some spruce, some pistache, some myrtle, some Ralphie, some ivy berries. I'm going to put in some of the red berried skimmia, and then a little bit of eucalyptus, and then I'm going to lay that posy on top of the wire that's on the stems of the previous posy. I'm going to hold it nice and tight, and I'm going to bind those stems 3 times with my binding wire nice and tightly, lay it back down, and then I'm going to twist. Okay, so I'm going to create my new posy again. So some spruce, some pistache, some myrtle, Ralphie, eucalyptus, buried ivy, and I'm going to go in with some blue viburnum and some red rose hips as well. And then I'm going to add in a little bit of my dried nigella. Anything missing? Okay, and I'm then going to place that down on the binding wire of my previous posy, and I'm going to wrap that nice and tight 3 times. So taking the spruce and the pistache and the myrtle and the Ralphie, eucalyptus, ivy berries. I'm going to put some skimmer in this one, which is the red berry. And yeah, that's all we're going to put in this one. So that's going to lay on top of the binding wire of my previous posy, 3 times round with the binding wire nice and tightly. Lay it back down and then twist. Okay. So spruce, pistache, Ralphie, a couple of bits of that, 3 bits of that, some ivy berries, and I'm going to put some of the blue viburnum berries on top too, and some rosehip berries. And then I'm going to lay that posy on top of my previous posy. I'm trying to work out whether to add some skimmer. I'm going to put some skimmer in there as well. And that goes over the top of my previous posy, and we wrap it round 3 times nice and tightly. Place that down and then twist. Okay, next posy. Hopefully you're getting the gist of it now. Eucalyptus. I'm going to go with some skimmer again and some nigella, the dried nigella, and a little bit of the ivy berries to sit on the front. Okay. Lay that down on top. Oh, I forgot the myrtle. There we go. That's what it was missing. Some of the buried myrtle. Lay that on top of the previous posy stems. And we're going to wrap nice and tightly around. Lay it down and then twist. Okay, so we've got about a third left. So I think we've got maybe 1, 3 or 4 posies left to do. So I take some spruce, some stash. You might find at the end that you have some foliage left over. Don't be sort of tempted to make your posies bigger as you get towards the end, because it will sort of create sort of an imbalance on the wreath. I would suggest using that foliage that you have left over, you know, for a little bud vase, tablescape, or, you know, a little arrangement, you know, that you can have in your home, rather than sort of making the last few posies really sort of oversized. I'm going to add some nigella to this one, and some skimmia, and a little bit of rosehip, and some blueberries too, another viburnum. Okay, so then that is going on top of the binding wire of your previous posy, nice and tight. Wrap that round 3 times, lay that down, and then twist. Okay, so I think we've got 2 or 3 left. So spruce, stash, myrtle, ooh, I'm going to go for Ralphie, and some ivy berries, and another piece of skimmia. Okay, I'm just going to snip that end just there, 'cause it's just a bit of a longer stem. So that's laid on top of my previous posies, binding wire, and I'm binding that 3 times over the stems. I'm going to lay that back down, and then I'm going to twist. So I think we've got 1.5. So I think we've got 1 normal size posy, and then I think we'll go with a smaller posy to finish off. Okay, so spruce, pistache, myrtle, and then some eucalyptus, Ralphie, ivy, and then I'm going to put some nigella in there. Ooh. And some more skimmia, and then the last of my viburnum berries, and then a little bit of my rosehip. I'm going to trim that posy down, because again, for some reason the stems are a little bit longer. So I'm going to take my posy, place it on top of my previous posy wreath, binding wire, and then wrap that round tight. Okay, so you'll see, I'll show you, that there is just a little bit of a gap here, which needs a slightly smaller posy. So this will be the last posy to go in, and it is a little bit more tricky, so I'll talk you through that now. So you're going to make a smaller posy, and by smaller I mean shorter and probably less dense, so you're not using quite as much, but you're also not going to have the stems as long. You might trim once you put your posy together, that's absolutely fine. So put some spruce in, some myrtle, a little bit of nigella, the last of the skimmia, and then I'm going to put some Ralphie in there, and some ivy berries too. Okay, right, so I've made, as you can see, sort of a smaller posy there, and I'm just going to trim off the bottom sort of inch, being careful with my fingers, just to make a sort of little posy. So that's the smallest posy in comparison to the rest of them. I'm going to hold it really tight in my hand, and I'm going to tuck it underneath the first posy. So that goes underneath, and then you then bind over the top, being careful not to sort of bind any of the foliages from the first posy that you put on your wreath. You keep going nice and tight. Bring it back over to the outside of your wreath, and then I'm going to sort of take a few inches, maybe 4 inches of the wire, and then I'm going to cut it. And then at the back of your wreath, you take your wire and you just wrap it round. You'll see some copper. You just wrap it round like you're sewing and casting off. You wrap it round the ring, like this. Wrap it round the ring as if you're sort of sewing, just to kind of secure it. I mean, if I'm honest, if you found it tight enough, even if you just cut it, it's not going to come apart. So there we have the wreath as it stands, and now we can start adding in our lovely kind of Christmassy textural elements. Okay, so I'm going to put my bow at the top. So what I will do is put my twine on first. So I've kept mine behind. So I'm simply going to go in between 2 of the posies where I can see some binding wire, and just make it sort of in half and simply tie it in a knot, and then put it together, the 2 sort of sections of twine, and then I'm going to re-knot it at the top, and that is how I will hang my wreath, like so. And then I will just trim the top. Okay, and now I will know that that is my top, where my twine is. That's where my ribbon is going to be. So I'm going to add in my textural elements around that, knowing that that's where the ribbon is. Okay, so you will have your pine cones and your lotus pods to go in. They will all be ready wired for you. So I'm going to start with my larger pine cones, and I'm going to put them into my wreath in a triangle, so in a sort of a 3 in the shape of a triangle. And I'm going to point them in the sort of direction that my wreath has gone in. If you can feel the wire at the back, just bend it back on itself so that it doesn't risk scratching your door. So I'm going to point my cones in the sort of the clockwise motion of my wreath. So I'm not going to sort of sit them upright, sort of facing the sky. I'm going to put them at an angle. It just creates that lovely flow to your wreath. Bend the wire back on itself, and then I'm going to put in my 3 lotus seed heads. So they will go in again in a triangle shape. So one will go here, and then one will go here, and then one will go I'm going to go up here. Okay, so that is all of our sort of textural elements in, and then now it's for the bow. Time for the bow. I don't really have like a snazzy technique for my bow. Oh, sorry, I've forgotten the other pine cones. They need to go in first, so I'm going to pop those in a triangle too. And there. And then there. So yes, so going back to the bow, I don't have a sort of posh technique to tie my bows. I tend to just tie them how you know, you would tie a sort of shoelace, but I kind of maybe do a little bit of a different sort of angle on some of it, which I'll show you now, to make it so that the velvet is at the front at all times. So make sure I've got my length here, and that length is longer. So I do it as like a normal, excuse my filthy hands, a normal bow. I then twist it so that the tone of the velvet that's going over is the same as this. So that goes over and under. I will then twist it at the back so that the velvet that I want to see is going through the hole of the bow. And you can obviously sort of mess around with it once it's on, and that's probably the easiest way to do it, is once it's on your wreath you can sort of play around with it a bit more, and then I pull. And that is honestly just the way I do it. I don't, you know, there are tutorials on YouTube that you can look at, but I just personally prefer a nice looking bow, don't get me wrong, but one that's just not too perfect. And then you can sort of fold, once your ribbon is on your wreath, you can then fold your tails so they sort of match. Sorry, not match, so that they are, well yeah, they match the velvet. But I'm going to make my bow a bit smaller, I think it's too big. Okay. And then the tails should sort of come just around, depending on how big your wreath is actually, and that will basically be determined by how big you cut your foliage. But it should, the tail should come sort of just around the bottom of your wreath, and then I'm going to cut my tails at an angle just to create that point at the bottom. I'll then take the single piece of wire that you have in your wreath kit. I'll then thread that at the back behind the loop, bend it back on itself, and then just twist it. It doesn't have to look pretty, you won't see it at all. It's just to basically secure the wire to the ribbon. And then where I've put my twine, that is where I will place my bow. I place mine slightly below the half mark, so I don't put it at the top, I don't put it in the middle, I put it nearer, I put it nearer the bottom. So that wire just goes straight through, you pull it through, and then you bend it back on itself so that you're not risking scratching your door. And that is when you can sort of start playing around with your ribbon and making it sort of sit better. Like that. In terms of looking after your wreath, you can make it last longer by keeping the moss base at the back damp, so you can just get a jug and just trickle some water over it. I personally don't tend to do it, I just let mine dry out. Mine is always on my door well into the new year until my spring wreath goes on, so don't worry too much about it in terms of upkeep. You know, our weather is cold enough during the winter to keep it looking as fresh as possible. So there you have it, that is your traditional wreath.